Section 1 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1, Laus Deo, by Lawrence Labree. Almighty Father, universal God, at whose command creation sprang to light, how can we cast our mortal eyes abroad, and view thy marvellous majesty and might, nor feel our hearts expand with holy love, toward him who formed the lion and the dove? When erst this globe was but a shapeless ball, void without form, and darkness covered all, thou from his throne the dusty chaos hurled, and light celestial beamed o'er all the world. Father, to thee when shades are on the earth, and hushed each sound of revelry and mirth, man's fervent prayer ascends. Thou knowest his heart, the temple whence his holiest feelings start, and thou disdaineth not his prayers to hear, if they but rise devoted and sincere. Even nature joins her voice, and helps to raise the song of universal love and praise. The feathered warbler from the leafy tree pours forth its richest melody to thee. The impetuous torrent joins the swelling throng, and adds its thunder to the anthem's song. Majestic ocean shakes his frothy mane, catches the echoes and repeats again, till all creation swells the choir to sing the everlasting praise of heaven's King. Thus unto thee, O God, great praise is given by all on earth and all the hosts of heaven. Our heavenly Father, when man steps astray, guide thou his feet, direct anew his way, nor let him wander far in error's maze, a slave to folly and her luresome ways. Implant within his heart a passion meek, to love religion and her paths to seek, that when his end shall come, his soul may fly to hold communion with the just on high. End of section 1. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 2 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2. The Lover's Quarrel by Miss Jewsbury. I wish I could describe the young lady Sybil. She was rather tall than otherwise, and her head was carried with a toss of the prettiest pride I ever saw. In truth, there was a supernatural grace in her figure, by which she was in duty bound to be more lofty in her demeanour than other people. Her eyes were of a pure, dark hazel, and seemed to wander from the earth as though they were surprised how they happened to drop out of the skies. And the sweet, high and mighty witchery that sported round her threatening lips inspired one with a wonderful disposition to fall down and worship her. It was, of course, not to be expected that such a strangely gifted lady should be so easily contented with her cavaliers as those who were not gifted at all, and Sybil very properly allowed it to be understood that she despised the whole race. She likewise allowed it to be understood that, the world being by no means good enough for her, she conceived the best society it afforded to be her own wilful cogitations, and that she meant to pass the whole of her pretty life in solitude and meditation. People conjectured that she was in love and too proud to show it, and Sybil surmised that they were vastly impertinent, and by no means worth satisfying. There was a small grotto by the lake that wound before the old arched windows of the hall. A world of fine foliage was matted fantastically above and around it, so as to exclude every intruder but the kingfisher, who plunged meteor-like on his golden prey, and vanished in the shade before he was well seen. And an endless variety of woodbines leaped from branch to branch, swinging their dewy tendrils in the air, and showering fragrance upon the green moss beneath, or stealing round the rustic pinnacles, like garlands twined by Cupid for his favourite hiding-place. It was in this choice retreat that the Lady Sybil chose to forget the world in which she was born, and imagine that for which she seemed to have been created, and in this world, without manifesting any particular symptoms of exhaustion, excepting that she had grown a little paler and more slender, she continued for 3 whole years. On the 3rd anniversary of her resolution, she knew it was the 3rd, because the said resolution happened to have been made on the same day that her wild cousin, who had earned for himself the title of Child Wilful, chose for his departure to the wars. On the 3rd anniversary, as on all other days, Sybil again tripped down the chase to live in paradise till tea-time. But, not as on other days, the noble summer sunset seemed to have stained her cheek with a kindred hue. Ere she reached her wilderness, she looked back, again and again, at the hall, slackened her pace that it might not appear hurried, and gazed as long upon the swans and water-lilies as though they really occupied her thoughts. Meanwhile, the flower of the fox-hunting chivalry were carousing with her father in the banqueting-room, and furnishing their glasses to her health. The most mighty and censorious dames of the land were seen stalking up and down the terrace, as stately and as stiff as the peacocks clipped out of the yew trees at either end of it. Sybil seemed to have lost the faculty of despising them, and was half afraid that her desertion would be thought strange. As she stood, irresolute whether to go on or turn back, she was startled by a voice close by, and the blood leapt in a deeper crimson to her cheek. "Sybil, dear Sybil!" it exclaimed. "Wilt thou come, or must I fetch thee, before the whole posse of them?" Sybil tossed her head and laughed, with an agitated look, which was meant to be indifferent, strolling carelessly into the shade, just in time to prevent the intruder from putting his threat into action. He was a light, well-made cavalier, with black moustaches and ringlets, and a high-born eye and forehead, which could have looked almost as proud as Sybil's. As for his accomplishments, the fine Frenchified slashing of his costume, and the courageous manner in which he assaulted a lady's hand, bespoke him a wonder. "And so, my gallant cousin," said Sybil, with a voice which was a little out of breath, and with a feeble effort to extricate her fingers, "and so you have brought your valour back to besiege my citadel again. Sweet arrogance, is it not the day 3,000 years on which we parted, and did I not promise to be here at sunset? I believe you threatened me that you would. Pray, have you run away from battle to be as good as your word? And pray, did you always consider it a threat, or did you tell me that this grotto should be your hermitage till my return? And pray, for a 3rd time, do not be inquisitive, and trouble yourself to let go of my hand, and sit down on that seat over the way, and tell me what you have been doing these 3 years. I will, as you desire, take both your hands, and the other half of your chair, and tell you, as you surmise, that I have been thinking of you till the thought became exceedingly troublesome. And now oblige me by telling me whether you are as proud as ever since you lost your beauty, or whether you have ever mustered humility to drop a tear for the mad blood which I have shed in toiling to be worthy such a mighty lady." Sybil laughed, and snatched her hand away from him to draw it across her eyes. "Dear Sybil," he continued in a gentler tone, "and has not that wild heart changed in 3 years? And has not such an age of experience made our boy and girl flirtation a folly to be amended? And do I find you the same, excepting far more lovely, the same perverse being who would not have given her wayward prodigal for the most dismally sensible lord of the creation? Often as I have feared, I have had a little comforter which told me you could not change. See, Sybil, your miniature, half given, half stolen at our last parting. It has been my shield in a dozen fights, has healed with its smile many wounds. It has asked me if this was a brow whereon to register deceit, if these were the lips to speak it, if these were the eyes. As I live, they are weeping even now." She did not raise them from her bosom, but answered with a smile of feigned mortification, that she thought it was very impertinent to take such minute observations. "I, too, have had my comforter," she said, drawing the fellow miniature from her bosom, and holding it playfully before his eyes. "It has been my shield against a dozen follies. It has warned me to benefit by sad experience. It has asked me if this was the brow whereon to register anything good, if these were the lips to speak it, if these were the eyes. As I live, they are conceited even now. But have you indeed kept my picture so close to your heart? And do you indeed think that your old rival, Sir Leuben of the Golden Dell, would have given me a farthing for it? Did you ever try him? Oh, child wilful, can you change countenance at such a name even now? No, I did not try him, and, for you are a stranger and must be indulged, I will tell you wherefore. I would not have given it to him for his head, not for as many of them as would have built a tower to yonder moon. So now see if you can contrive to be jealous of him. Nay, you shall not touch it. Do you remember how often, when it pleased you to be moody, you threatened to take it from me? No more of that, sweet Sybil. And will you never counterfeit a headache to hide your displeasure, when I dance with Sir Dunce, or gallop with Sir Gosling? No, never, Sybil. And will you never take leave of me for ever, and return 5 minutes afterward to see how I bear it? Never while I live. Why then I give you leave to ask my father's leave to stay a whole week at the Hall, for I have a great deal to say to you, when I can think of it. I will ask him for yourself, Sybil. No, no, sir child, you will not do any such thing. When you went from hence, it was with a college character, which was by no means likely to ingratiate you with reasonable people, whatever it may have done with other folks, and you must not talk to my father of the treasured Sybil till you are better acquainted with him. Talk of ploughs and politics as much as you please. Make it appear that, now the wars are over, there is some chance of turning your sword into a pruning hook, and yourself into an accomplished squire, and then, alas, for the high-minded Sybil. It was not long afterward that Childe Wilful, to the great surprise of Sybil, arrived at the Hall in hot haste from foreign parts. He had always been a favourite for his liveliness, and was, indeed, almost as much liked as abused. The old lord took him by the hand, with a comical expression of countenance which seemed to inquire how much mischief he had done, and the old ladies thought him vastly improved by travel, and awfully like a great warrior. The only persons to whom his presence was not likely to be strikingly agreeable were a few round-shouldered suitors of Sybil, who, in common with the country squires in general, were largely gifted with the blessings of fleet horses and tardy wits. Among these stood preeminent Sir Lubin of the Golden Dale. He was a tall man, with not a bad figure, and really a handsome face, though the dangerous tendency of the first was somewhat marred by the peculiar ideas of the Graces, and the latter was perfectly innocuous from an undue economy of expression. Altogether, Sir Lubin was a very fine camel. He was a man of much dignity, always preserving a haughty silence when he did not exactly know what to say, and very properly despising those whom he could not hope to outshine. Thus it was that the meeting between Sir Lubin and Childe Wilful was very similar to that between Ulysses and the ghost of Ajax. Had this been all the mortification which the child was doomed to undergo, he might perhaps have contrived to bear it with fortitude, but Sybil had subjected him to the task of obtaining a good character, and his trials were insupportable. In the first place, he had to tell stories of sacked cities and distressed virgins at the tea-table till he became popular enough with the maiden aunts to be 3 parts out of his mind, for Sybil was all the time compelled to endure the homage of her other lovers. It is true that her keen wit could no more enter their double-blocked skulls than the point of her needle could have penetrated the Macedonian phalanx. But then each villain fixed his eyes upon her with all the abstracted expression of a bull's eye and a target, and seemed so abominably happy that the sight was excruciating. Sometimes, too, Sir Lubin would muster brains to perceive that he was giving pain, and would not do his best to increase it, by whispering in her ear, with a confidential smile, some terrible nothing, for which he deserved to be exterminated, while to mend the matter the old ladies would speak upon the elegance of his manner, and hint that Sybil was evidently flattered by his attention, because she seemed too happy to be scornful, and had lost all her taste in solitude. They would undoubtedly make a very handsome couple, and the child was appealed to whether he did not think that they would have a very fine family. In the second place, his opinion of ploughs and politics, on which love had taught him to discourse but too successfully, made him a fixture at the punch-bowl, while Sir Lubin and his tribe profaned Sybil's hand in country dances as long as they had breath for a plunge. It moreover left them ample opportunity to negotiate with the aunts upon the arrangement of her plans for the next day, when he was still condemned to admire some new farm or ride 10 miles to rejoice with his host over a wonderful prize bullock. Sometimes, too, the old lord would apologize for taking him away by observing that it was better to leave Sybil to her lovers, for it was time that she should take up with some one of them, and the presence of third parties might abash her. In the third place, when he retired to bed to sum up all the pleasures of the day, it was never quite clear to him that Sybil did not expose him to more disquietude than was absolutely necessary. It might indeed be proper that her attachment to him should not be too apparent till he was firmly established in grace, seeing that all his merit was the only thing that could be put in the scale against the finest glebe in the country. But then could she not appear sufficiently careless about him, without being so unusually complaisant to such a set of louts? If his presence made her happy, There was no necessity to give them license to presume to be happy likewise, and besides, she might surely find some moments for revisiting her grotto instead of uniformly turning from his hasty whispers with, "It is better not." It was not so formerly, and it was very reasonable to suppose that her 3 years' constancy had been sustained by some ideal picture of what he might turn out, in which she was now disappointed. He could not sleep. His restless fantasy continually beheld her bright eyes looking tenderness upon the wooden face of Sir Lubin. He turned to the other side, and was haunted by a legion of young Lubins, who smiled upon him with Sybil's looks till he almost groaned aloud. In the morning he came down with a hag-ridden countenance, which made people wonder what was the matter with him, and Sybil asked with her look of ineffable archness whether he was experiencing a return of his headaches. Time rolled on very disagreeably. The child grew every day paler and more popular. The old ladies gave him more advice, and the old lord gave him more wine, and Sybil grew mortified at his distrust, and Sir Lubin grew afraid of his frown. And one half of the hall could not help being sorry, and the other half were obliged to be civil. Ajax and Ulysses had stepped into each other's shoes, and Sybil, to keep the peace, was obliged to accede to an interview in her little boudoir. It was a fine, honey-dropping afternoon. The sweet south was murmuring through the lattice among the strings of the guitar, and the golden fish were sporting till they almost flung themselves out of their crystal globe. It was just the hour for everything to be sweet and harmonious. But Sybil was somewhat vexed, and the child was somewhat angry. He was much obliged to her for meeting him, but he feared that he was taking her from more agreeable occupations, and he was, moreover, alarmed lest her other visitors should want some one to amuse them. He merely wished to ask if she had any commands to his family, for whom it was time he should think of setting out, and when he had obtained them, he would no longer trespass upon her condescension. Sybil leant her cheek upon her hand, and regarded him patiently until he had done. "My commands," she gravely said, "are of a confidential nature, and I cannot speak of them if you sit so far off." As she tendered her little hand, her features broke through their mock ceremony into a half-smile, and there was an enchantment about her which could not be withstood. "Sybil," he exclaimed, "why have you taken such pains to torment me? And why have you so ill attended to the injunctions which I gave you?" "Ill! Heaven and earth! Have I not laboured to be agreeable till my head is turned topsy-turvy?" "Oh yes, and hindsight before as well, for it is anything but right. But did I tell you to pursue this laudable work with fuming and frowning, and doubting and desperation, till I was in agony lest you should die of your exertion, and leave me to wear the willow?" The cavalier stated his provocation with much eloquence. "Dearest Sybil," he continued, "I have passed a sufficient ordeal. If I really possess your love, let me declare mine at once, and send these barbarians about their business. Or rather be sent about your own, if you have any, for you cannot suppose that the specimen which you have given of your patient disposition is likely to have told very much in your favour." "Then why not teach them the presumption of their hopes, and tell them that you despise them?" "Because they are my father's friends, and because, whatever their hopes may be, they will probably wait for encouragement before they afford me an opportunity of giving my opinion thereupon." "But has there been any necessity to give them so much more of your time, so many more of your smiles, than you have bestowed upon me?" "And is it you who asks me this question? Oh, is it possible to meet our attentions to those we love with the same indifference which we use toward the rest of the world? Would nothing, do you think, no tell-tale countenance, no treacherous accent, betray the secret which it is our intent to maintain? Unkind to make poor Sybil's pride confess so much." The cavalier did not know whether he ought to feel quite convinced. He counted the rings upon the fingers, which were still locked in his own, 3 times over. "Sybil," he said at last, "I cannot bear them to triumph over me, even in their own bright fancies. If you are sincere with me, let us anticipate the slow events of time. Let us seek happiness by the readiest means, and trust me, if it is difficult to obtain consent to our wishes, you are too dear to despair of pardon for having acted without it." "And you would have me fly with you?" Sybil shrank from the idea. Her pride was no longer assumed in sport. "You do well to reproach me with the duplicity which I have practised. It is but just to suppose that she who has gone so far would not scruple to make the love which has been lavished upon her the inducement for her disobedience, that the pride which has yielded so much would be content to be pursued as a fugitive, and to return as a penitent." "Then, Sybil, you do not love me." "I am not used to make assurances of that kind, any more than I am inclined to submit to the charge of deceit." "Methinks, Lady Sybil," he replied, with somewhat of bitterness, "that you very easily take offence tonight. It is certainly better to be free from one engagement before we enter upon another." Sybil's heart beat high, but she did not speak. "It is possible I may have mistaken your reasons for enjoining me to silence, for it is, no doubt, advisable that your more eligible friend should have the opportunity of speaking first." Sybil's heart beat higher, and the tears sprang to her eyes, but her head was turned away. "We have stayed too long," she said, with an effort at composure. "I thank you, Lady Sybil," he replied, rising haughtily to depart, "for allowing me to come to a right understanding. And now—" Her anger never had been more than a flash. She could hardly believe him serious, and if he was, he would soon repent. "And now," she interrupted him, relapsing into her loveliest look of raillery, "Child Wilful would be glad of his picture again?" "You certainly will oblige me by restoring it." "Why do you not ask Sir Lupin for it?" "Lady Sybil, I am serious, and I must beg to remark that it can be but an unworthy satisfaction to retain it for your boast to your new lovers." "I do not see that there is anything to boast of in it. The face is not a particularly handsome one, and as for him for whom it is meant, he has never made a figure in any history excepting his own letters. Here is one in my own dressing-case. I pray you stand still now while I read over the wondrous exploits which you performed in your last battle, for I think you must have looked just as you do now." There is no saying whether his resolution would have been firm enough to persist in his dire demand, had not the Lady Sybil's attendant at that moment entered with Sir Lupin's compliments, and it was past the hour when she was engaged to ride with him. Child Wilful's heart was armed with a thicker coat of mail than ever, and his lips writhed into a bitter smile. "Do not let me detain you, Lady Sybil," he said. "Perhaps your gentlewoman will be good enough to find me the picture among your cast-off ornaments." This was rather too much, to be exposed in her weakest point to the impertinent surprise of her servant. "Nay, nay," she replied in confusion. "Have done for the present. If you ask me for it tomorrow, I will return it." "I shall not be here tomorrow, and it is hardly compatible with Lady Sybil's pride to retain presents which the donor would resume." Her anger was a little indignant. His rejoinder was a little more provoking. The maid began to laugh in her sleeve, and Sybil felt herself humiliated. It is but a short step, in mighty spirits, from humiliation to discord, and Sybil soon called in the whole force of her dignity, and conjured up a smile of as much asperity as the child's. "No," she exclaimed, "it is not among my cast-off ornaments. I mistook it for the similitude of true affection, of generosity and manliness, and have worn it where those qualities deserve to be treasured up." The picture was produced from its pretty hiding-place, and carelessly tendered to him. "You will perhaps remember," she continued, "that there was a fellow to this picture, and that the original of it has as little inclination as other people to be made a boast of." "Undoubtedly, Lady Sybil. It was my intention to make you perfectly easy on that point." The little jewel was removed coldly from his breast, and seemed to reproach him as it parted, for it had the same mournful smile with which Sybil sat for it when he was preparing for the wars. He gave it to her, and received his own in return. It was yet warm from its sweet depository, and the touch of it thrilled to his soul, but he was determined for once to act with consistency. As he closed the door he distinguished a faint sob, and a feeling of self-reproach seemed fast coming over him. But then his honour! Was he to endure the possibility of being triumphed over by such an eternal blockhead as Sir Lupin of the Golden Dell? Sybil made her appearance in the drawing-room soon after him, in her riding-dress. Her manner was cold and distant, and she heard him feign business at home without condescending to notice it, only that there was a fever on her cheek which spoke an unwonted tumult of feeling. Her horse was at the door, and Sir Lupin was ready to escort her down. As she took leave of her cousin, they were both haughty, and both their hands trembled. In a minute she was seen winding through the old avenue. Sir Lupin, who was observed poking his head from his shoulders with all the grace of a goose in a basket, was evidently saying tender things, and altogether looking cruelly like a dangerous rival. The child drew his breath through his teeth, as though they had been set on edge, and moved from the window like a spirit turned out of paradise. Sir Lupin did not find his ride very satisfactory. He discovered that it was a fine evening, made a clever simile about Lady Sybil's cheek and a poppy, and another about her cruelty and a bramble. But they had little or no effect. She answered no when she ought to have said yes, looked bewildered when he asked her opinion, and in fact, as he poetically expressed it, was extracting honey from the flowers of her imagination. "Will he indeed have the heart to leave me thus?" said Sybil to herself, "unkind, ungrateful, to take my little treasure from me, the sole companion of my bosom, the witness of all my tears I have shed for him, the comforter of all my doubts of his fidelity. It is gone for ever. I can never stoop to receive it back. I never will forgive him, no, never, that is, if he is really gone." And really, when she returned, he was gone. Sybil, however, would not persuade herself that it was not his intention to return, and every night had to take her pride to task for looking out upon the road all the day. Perhaps he would write, and she stole away, as heretofore alone, to meet the tardy post a mile off. There were letters for my lord, for Sir Lubin, for the Lady Jemima. No, no, I want not them, for the Lady Sybil. What for the Lady Sybil? The letters were turned over and over, and still the same deadening sound fell like a knell upon her heart. Nothing for the Lady Sybil. She returned unwillingly to her company, and retired at the first opportunity, to wonder if her cousin was really in earnest, if he had really deserted her, and whether she had ever given him cause to do so. Her pride would seldom suffer her to weep, and the tears seemed swelling at her heart till each throb was a throb of pain. Sometimes she would bewilder herself with suggesting other reasons than want of inclination for his absence and for his silence. Might he not wish to return, and be prevented by his family, who had not seen him for so long, and would naturally be importuned? Might he not be fearful of writing, lest the letter should fall into the hands for which it was not intended, and betray the secret which she had desired him to keep? It surely might be her own overweening caution that was afflicting her, and he might be as impatient as herself. Her imagination would begin to occupy itself in scenes until she forgot those which had really occurred, and her hand would rise fondly to her bosom to draw forth the semblance of her suffering cavalier. Alas! It was then that the poor Sybil's deceptive dreams were dispersed. The picture was gone, was even now, perhaps, the bosom companion of another, who pitied her with smiles, and gaily upbraided him for his falsehood. Then again would the flush of shame rush over her cheek, her maiden indignation determined to forget him, and her bewildered wits bury themselves upon plans of teaching him that she had done so. In the meantime, Sir Lubin began to congratulate himself that he had made an impression. Sybil had lost the spirit to repel his advances as she had done before, and the little which she afforded him of her company was clearly a pretty stratagem to bring him to an explanation. He had a great mind to be cruel in his turn, and lead her heart the dance, as he expressed it, which she had led his. But then she was very pale, and might have a fit of illness. On the evening when he resolved to make her happy, Sybil indeed received a letter, but it was from her lover's sister. It was full of the gay rattle which usually characterized the correspondence of hearts which have never known sorrow. But it was other news that Sybil looked for. She told through lively descriptions of fetes and finery and flirtations, scarcely knowing what she read, till at last her eyes glanced upon the name she sought. She stopped to breathe ere she proceeded, and then Child Wilful was gone too, and paying violent attentions to Lady Blanche. She tore the letter calmly into little strips. Her lips were compressed with beautiful but stern and desperate determination. That night Sir Lubin made his proposals, and in the delirium of fancied vengeance Sybil answered, she knew not what. It was not long after that the child was returning sadly home from the Lady Blanche. She was very beautiful, but oh, she had not the speaking glance of Sybil. She was lofty and high-minded, but it was not the sweet pride that fascinated while it awed. It was the aspiring woman, and not the playful and condescending seraph. She was accomplished, but they were the accomplishments approved by the understanding rather than the heart, the methodical work of education, and stored up for display. But Sybil was accomplished by heaven. Her gifts were like the summer breezes which sported around him, wild, exquisite, and mysterious, which were the same whether wasted on the desert, or wafting delight to the multitude. She was a lovely line of poetry in a world of prose. She was a blossom dropped from paradise to shame all the flowers of the earth. Oh, but Sybil was false. And oh, again, it was just possible he might be mistaken. He was sadly bewildered. He had another bad headache, and was strongly of opinion that it was not the way to forget Sybil to put her in competition with other people. He hardly liked to confess it to himself, but he was not quite sure that, if he had any excuse which would not compromise his dignity, he would turn his horse's head toward the hall, and suffer the fiends which were tormenting him to drive him at their own pace. It happened that such excuse was not far distant. He had no sooner alighted at home than he was presented with a hasty note which had been some days awaiting him from Sybil's mother, inviting him. A film came over his eyes, and the pulsation of his heart was paralyzed. Inviting him to what he knew would give him great pleasure, Sybil's wedding! Should he send an excuse and stay at home and prove that he did not care about it? Or should he plunge headlong into their revelry, and spare neither age nor sex of the whole party? No matter, he would consider it on his way. He gave his steed the spur, as though the good animal had been Sir Lubin himself, and set out to cool his blood and shake his wits into their places by a moonlit gallop of 100 miles. The morning was far advanced when he came within sight of the hall. He was almost exhausted, and the preparations for festivity upon the fine slope of the chase came over his soul with sickness and dismay. The high blood of his poor animal was barely sufficient to answer the feeble urging of its rider, and the slow stride, which was accompanied by a deeper sob, seemed fast flagging to a standstill. The child felt that he was too late. He inquired of a troop of merrymakers round a roasting ox, and found that the wedding cavalcade had set off for the church. He looked down on the hilt of his sword. He was still in time for vengeance, still in time to cut short the bridegroom's triumph, to disappoint the anticipations of spirits of fury. Were there none to inspire a few minutes' vigor into his fainting steed? The steed toiled on as though he had possessed the burning heart of his master. Troops of peasant girls, dressed fantastically, and waving garlands on either side of the road, soon told him that he was near the scene of the sacrifice. They had received a sheep-faced duck from the head of the blushing Sir Lubin, a sprawling wave of his long arm, thrust in all the pride of silver and satin from the window of his coach and six. They had beheld the fevered and bewildered loveliness of the Lady Sybil, looking among the bridesmaids intense as a planet amid its satellites, and were all in ecstasies that if possible increased his agony. Another lash, another bound, and he turned the corner which brought him full upon the elm-embowered church, surrounded by the main body of the May-Day multitude, and a string of coaches which displayed all the arms in the country. He sprang from his horse and dashed through them like a meteor. The party were all standing before the altar, and he staggered and restrained his steps to hear how far the ceremony had proceeded. There was a dead silence, and all eyes were fixed upon Sybil, who trembled, as it seemed, too much to articulate. "More water," said someone in a low voice. "She is going to faint again." Water was handed to her, and the clergyman repeated, "Wilt thou take this man to be thy wedded husband?" Sybil said nothing, but gasped audibly. Her father looked more troubled, and Sir Lubin opened his mouth wider and wider. The question was repeated, but still Sybil spoke not. It was pronounced a third time. Sybil shook more violently and uttered an hysterical scream. "Oh, merciful heaven!" she exclaimed. "It is impossible! I cannot! I cannot!" Her astonished lover sprang forward and received her fainting form in his arms. A glance at each other's countenance was sufficient to explain all the sufferings, to dissipate all the resentment. Concealment was now out of the question, and their words broke forth at the same instant. "Oh, faithless! How could you drive me to this dreadful extremity? Sweet Sybil, forgive me. I will atone for it by such penitence, such devotion, as the world never saw." "By Jove!" exclaimed the bridegroom, "but I do not like this." "By my word," added the Lady Jemima, "but here is a new lover." "By mine honour," responded the Lady Bridget, "but he is an old one." "By my word and honour, too," continued the lady, "something else. I suspected it long ago." "And by my grey beard," concluded the old lord, "I wish I had done so too. Look you, Sir Lubin, Sybil is my only child, and must be made happy her own way. I really thought she had been pining and dying for you, but since it appears I was mistaken, why, e'en let us make the best of it. You can be bridesman still, though you cannot be bridegroom. And who knows but in our revels tonight you may find a lady less liable to change her mind." Sir Lubin did not understand this mode of proceeding, and would have come to high words but for the peculiar expression in Child Wilful's eye, which kept them bubbling in his throat. He could by no means decide upon what to say. He gave 2 or 3 pretty considerable hymns, but he cleared the road in vain, for nothing was coming, and so at last he made up his mind to treat the matter with silent contempt. He bowed to the company with a haughty dive, kicked his long sword as he turned between his legs, and strode, or rather rode, out of the church as fast as his dignity would permit. The crowd on the outside, not being aware of what had passed within, and taking it for granted that it was all right that the bridegroom on such occasions should go home alone, wished him joy very heartily and clamorously, and the 6 horses went off at a long trot, which was quite grand. Sybil and her cavalier looked breathlessly for what was to come next. "The wedding feast must not be lost," said the old lord. "Will nobody be married?" Sybil was again placed at the altar, and in the room of Sir Lubin was handed the Chevalier Wilful. "Wilt thou take this man for thy wedded husband?" demanded the priest. Sybil blushed, and still trembled, but her faintings did not return, and if her voice was low when she spoke the words, "I will," it was distinct and musical as the clearest note of the nightingale. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gini, Rosario. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Red-Nosed Lieutenant, a Campaigner's Story. 25 years ago, I was just 25 years of age. I was thus neither young nor old. In addition, I was neither handsome nor ugly, neither rich nor poor, neither active nor indolent, neither a Socrates nor a simpleton. More ordinary men than I had been married for love. Poorer men had got credit and rolled on their carriage wheels till it was out, and greater fools had been cabinet councillors. Yet all this did not satisfy me. Years had swept along, and I was exactly the same in point of publicity at 25 that I had been at 15. Let no man say that the passion for being something or other in the world's eye is an improbable thing. Show me that man, and I will show him my lord A, driving a mail coach, the Earl of B, betting at a boxing match, the Marquis of C, the rival of his own grooms, and the Duke of D, a director of the opera. My antagonist has only to look and be convinced, for what could throw those patricians into the very jaws of public jest but the passion for publicity? I pondered long upon this, and my resolution to do something was at length fixed. But the grand difficulty remained. What was the thing to be done? What was the grand chemin d'honneur, the longest stride to the temple of fame, the royal road to making a figure in one's generation? The step was too momentous to be rashly taken, and I took time enough, for I took a year. On my 26th birthday, I discovered that I was as wise and as public as on my birthday before, and a year older besides. While I was in this state of fluctuation, my honored uncle arrived in town and called upon me. Let me introduce this most excellent and most mutilated man. He had commenced his career in the American War, a bold, brave, blooming ensign. What he was now I shall not describe, but he had taken the earliest opportunity of glory, and at Bunker's Hill had lost an eye. He was nothing the worse as a mark for an American rifle. And at Brandywine he had the honor of seeing Lafayette run away before him, and pay only a right leg as his tribute to the victory. My uncle followed on the road to glory, gaining a new leaf of laurel, and losing an additional fragment of himself in every new battle, till with Burgoyne he left his nose in the swamps of Saratoga, whence, having had the good fortune to make his escape, he distinguished himself at the siege of Yorktown, under Cornwallis, and left only an arm in the ditch of the rampart. He had returned a major, and after lying on his back for 2 years in the military hospital, was set at liberty to walk the world on a pair of crutches and be called colonel. I explained my difficulty to this venerable remnant of soldiership. "Difficulty!" cried he, starting up on his residuary leg. "I see none whatever. You are young, healthy, and have the use of all your limbs. The very thing for the army." I glanced involuntarily at his own contributions to the field. He perceived it, and retorted, "Sir, I know the difference between us as well as if I were the field surgeon. I should never have advised you to march if you had not limbs enough for the purpose, but you have your complement." "And therefore can afford to lose them, my good uncle?" said I. "Nephew," was the reply, "sneering is no argument, except among civilians. But if a man wants to climb at once to a name, let him try the army. Have you no estate? Why, the regiment is your freehold. Have you no education? Why, the color of your coat will stand you in place of it with 3/4 of the men and all the women. Have you no brains? Why, their absence will never be missed at the mess. And as for the field, not half a dozen in an army ever exhibit any pretensions of the kind." This was too flattering a prospect to be overlooked. I took the advice. In a week was gazetted into a marching regiment, and in another week was on board His Majesty's transport, No. 10, with a wing of the gallant 30 Regiment, tacking out to Portsmouth on our way to Gibraltar. Military men have it that there are 3 bad passages, the slow, the quick, and the neither quick nor slow, pronouncing the 2 former detestable, the latter. The storm making a man sick of the sea, the calm making him sick of himself, a much worse thing, and the alternation of calm and storm bringing both sickness into one. My first passage was distinguished by being of the third order. I found my fellow subalterns a knot of good-humored beings, the boys with the habit of men, the men with the tricks of boys, all full impressed with the honor of the epaulet, and thinking the man who wore 2 instead of 1 the most favored of all things under the sun. We at length came in sight of the famous rock. It loomed magnificently from the sea, and every glass was to the eye as the lines and batteries, that looked like teeth in its old white head, rose grimly out of the waters. The veterans of the corps were in high delight, and enumerated with the vigor of grateful recollection the cheapness of the wines, the snugness of the quarters, and the general laudable and illaudable pleasantries of the place. The younger listened with the respect due to experience, and for that evening an old red-nosed lieutenant, of whom no man had ever thought but as a lieutenant before, became the center of a circle, he blue-stocking, surrounded with obsequious listeners, by virtue of his preeminent knowledge of every wine-house in the garrison. Such is the advantage of situation. 9/10 of mankind, till they are placed on the spot of display, what are they but red-nosed lieutenants? While we stood on the deck of our tall ship, quietly surging along into the worst of all possible bays, the wind fell, and the sun plunged into the Atlantic like a ball of iron red-hot from the furnace. The garrison flag fell down with it, the evening gun fired, and we prepared for supper, whist, and our final bottle of port on board. In 3 minutes all this was a dream. Our men were priming, loading, and firing, our sails torn to rags, our masts shot through, our ship was rolling away on the current to Algeciras, the garrison lights were sinking behind us, and the whole ship, captains, sailors, officers, and soldiers, a scene of roaring confusion, blue lights and musketry. We were in action, but with what, no living eye could discern. Between the smoke of our own fire and the sudden darkness of the night, we could see nothing beyond an occasional flash that seemed to come out of the very bottom of the sea. It was before us and behind, above us and below. But the rattle of the balls against our sides and rigging, and now and then a shot taking effect on our company, told us that we had the usual enemy of the garrison reinforcements in full exercise upon us. In fact, the Spanish gunboats, which never missed their opportunity, were out, and never was good ship or gallant crew more piteously pelted. Let our romances talk of Spanish indolence, those fellows let nothing pass. From a cabbage boat to a 3-decker, they had a trial of their long guns on it, and if they could have made the night but half an hour longer, the left wing of the gallant 30 regiment would have closed their campaign in the dominions of His Catholic Majesty. But morning broke, and the gunboats, of which there were at least a dozen, seeing the frigate bearing down, which had left us to make the most of our own valor during the night, swept off with their oars to Algeciras, where 2 of the convoy were seen already lying. To do us justice, we had fired away at a prodigious rate, though we might as well have fired at the moon. There was not a cartridge left among us by daylight, nor a man who was not ready to pledge himself that he had done mortal execution. This foretaste of war was not quite to our liking, but we had gained the victory, such as it was, and conquerors are always easily reconciled to their escape. The gunboats had left the field, the rock was again in full view, shining out in the morning sun. The boats of the frigate hauled us along, for we had neither boat nor oar, nor rope nor sail, and with something of the pleasant expectation of being congratulated on our prowess, we floated into the harbor. This expectation, however, was not exactly fulfilled. As we moved slowly up toward the admiral's ship that lay like a huge bastion under the batteries, my eye accidentally fell on the red-nosed lieutenant. I saw him turning toward the cabin steps, and set this down for a disastrous omen. The ports and rigging of the flagship were crowded with men, and our hands were already at our caps to return the imaginary cheers. We were received with roars of laughter. Volleys of sea-wit were poured out upon us, We were burlesqued and jibed in all the naval jargon of the place, asked whether we liked Spanish pickles for supper, if the garabanzas, Spanish peas, were handsomely shelled, whether we had any cigars to sell, and a boat followed us with the crew pealing out, "See, the conquering hero comes!" The same roars met us from every ship of the fleet, and from our sluggard movements we had the whole in perfection. At the Sallyport, when we landed, the laughter of the mob was, if not quite so obstreperous, at least as general, and the same genius of the place followed us till we were lodged in our quarters out of the town. The burlesque of a transport's fighting had amused the regular proficients. Our ragged and dismantled state was calculated only to add to the joke. In short, the old rivalry of sailor and soldier was never less on an equality. This was the first lesson to our pride, and upon whomever else it might have been lost, it was not lost upon me. The garrison life amused me at first view. Its routine, its insipidity, its formality, have wearied many a man. I must leave it to others to tell how all this became more repulsive by the slavish obsequiousness demanded by the higher powers. Talk of courts or prisons, there is not more servility in the one, nor more restraint in the other. Talk of the Sublime Porte or the Day of Algiers, they are but outlines of the picture of governors, military secretaries, and town majors. Some time or other I shall fill them up from the life. A week tires your regular militaire of everything but the bottle. Half the time tired me of the place, the people, and the pompous deputies of the deputy governor. The governor was a statesman, and a lover of turtle and venison, two things not to be had in perfection out of England. In England, therefore, the governor remained adding by his uniform to the monthly splendor of the commander-in-chief's levees, and by his half-yearly speeches to the hereditary slumbers of the House of Lords. The gallant 30 were in the same predicament with myself. We scoffed at the mongrel population, Jew, Moor, Italian, Spanish, Negro, mulatto, the a la podrida of nations. We hated the aides-de-camp, and laughed at the infinite humility of their bows to their lords and masters, their tame squiring of the generals' wives, aunts, mothers, cousins, and daughters, and the exquisite insolence that repaid those hours of office. As for everything else, we had plenty of parades, sour wine, condemned cigars, and useless time on our hands. Even the old red-nosed lieutenant gave signs of discontent, and swore that the place was changed to all intents and purposes. The rest of us were like Thibaut in Frederick's Paradise at Potsdam. We conjugated from morning till night the verb je m'ennuie, tu t'ennuies, elle s'ennuie, all through its persons, tenses, and moods. But all things have an end. We received an order to join the expedition to Egypt. Never was regiment so delighted. We supped together upon the news, and drank farewell to Gibraltar, and confusion to in bumpers without measure. In the very height of our carousel, my eye dropped upon my old friend's red nose. It served me as a kind of thermometer. I observed it, diminished of its usual crimson. The spirit has fallen, thought I. There is ill luck in the wind. I took him aside, but he was then too far gone for regular counsel. He only clasped my hand with the fervor of a fellow drinker, and muttered out, lifting his glass with a shaking wrist, "Nothing but confoundedly bad brandy in Egypt for love or money." We sailed, cleared the straits, rushed on the back of the current for 6 hours, till we left the rock like the fragment of a cloud, congratulated each other on a speedy passage, and before the bottle in which we drank to it had gone round, found ourselves fixed in a dead calm. This is the temptation of the blue Mediterranean to all sins of omission and commission in all who spread sail upon its surface. An album of the oaths, praise, invectives, and ejaculations, begotten and born of its calms, from the lips of Turk, Genoese, Venetian, Greek, Corsican, Sicilian, Maltese, Sardinian, would be the rarest treasure to a traveler that was ever given to Europe since the reign of albums and the confusion of Babel. The wrath of the Englishman is loud and sufficiently expressive, but it wants, and will forever want, the exquisite pungency, variety, and vigor, the intense virulence and steam-engine volubility of the regular Mediterranean tongue. In this calm we remained for a mortal fortnight. The calm of the ocean is a whirlpool to such things in the loveliest of all seas. There is no tide to comfort you with the dream that you are in motion without feeling it. There is no wave to solace you with the faintest chance that the breeze will ever come. If the ship were screwed to the bottom of the sea, it could not give fewer symptoms of escape. If the sea were a field of ice, and the voyagers looking out for the North Pole, their labor could not be more uselessly employed. There stood our good ship, like the king on a chessboard, never to move among the checkers of red and blue, yellow and green, that inlaid the smooth and mighty expanse colored under the burning sun. We were scorched like so many locusts, were brown as Arabs, and as sick of our lives as Englishmen. So, thought I, this is the army. Glory and scarlet may be showy appendages. A good mess and a new name on the regimental colors are all well enough in their vocation, but where is the honor of being broiled alive? The worst had not arrived yet. A Jew had come on board as we weighed anchor. He brought us pumpkins, pantaloons, and the yellow fever. We now began to be aware of the full benefits of his visit. 3/4 of our crew were seized. The officers had their turn. The temperate men went off first. So much for science and the course of things. My old red-nosed acquaintance stood it out bravely, kept aloof from friend and enemy, and fought the evil at arm's length, bottle in hand. We had now lost 3 subalterns, and the rest were making up their minds to follow them, when my mentor came into the cabin, where I was stretched, frying like a Guatimosan or St. Lawrence, without the patience of either, in my shirt on the bare boards. I glanced at his thermometer, and never crimson on the lip of siren or sultana more exhilarated me than its intense purple. There is a wind coming, I saw in its first blush. The inquiry was scarcely made, when I was flung off the floor into a cot. The trunks, bottles, and benches were hurled about the cabin, and the ship was tumbled on her beam ends. The wind had come with a vengeance. My peep through the cabin window, the moment before the dead lights were up, showed me a sea that looked like the bottom of a cataract. Foam, black billows, bulging clouds, and absolute columns of rain. The whole firmament was up in arms. The wind roared louder than all the speaking trumpets of the deck, which were all in requisition at once. The thunders rattled like volleys of artillery, and away went our ship, stripped in a moment of every sail and rope, rotten with the heat and dews, up the Mediterranean, like an arrow from the bow. At this rate we flew on, rushing over shoal and by rock and craggy island, every one of which we approached with instant apprehension of finishing our mortal glories there. They were all, however, classic shores, and our names would perhaps have not been unhonored if we had laid our bodies under their burn. We might have been mentioned in the newspapers, and even have had an elegy in a magazine, but glory slipped from us on all sides. Wet, weary, half-starved, and frightened to death, we darted through every nook and channel that had ever figured in the history of the Cyclades, left Olympus on the one hand and Ida on the other, caught glimpses of Cos and Scio, Rhodes and Hydra, and peering through fog and cloud, and lashed by sheets of billow and foam, I wished them all 10,000 fathom under water. Nothing could stop us. We seemed like the Indian pilot in the tale, who was to sail round the world till the day of its ending. At length, one evening, the clouds in front took a more sullen hue. The sea rose in wilder surges, and the tempest tore out our remaining mast. Never were crew less indebted to the art of navigation for their progress. At midnight we struck on the coast of Asia Minor. How we escaped with life is beyond all my knowledge. I recollect nothing but having been thrown by a surge against my friend of the red nose, who was sitting singing, either mad or drunk, by the capstan. A mountain of water lifted us up together, and, further, I have no remembrance. My first returning sensation was that of being tossed about and scorched, sick and stiffened. I opened my eyes, and the first sight that I saw was the lieutenant. He was pouring his favorite brandy down my throat, and superintending half a dozen rough, long-bearded fellows in sheepskin jackets who were stripping and rubbing me under the most scorching sun that ever parched the human cuticle. As I rose, I perceived the same operation going on with others. We had lost no officer, but a few of our rank and file. The ship had been thrown in upon a wild shore, but so close to land that escape was easy to all who had not lost their senses. The insensible were saved the trouble of the effort by the waves, and the lieutenant and I had been rolled on the sand with our arms round each other's necks in the most amatory style possible. The ship was a wreck. The storm, when it scooped the crew out of her like a kernel, had made no scruple of doing its will by the shell, and had toyed with it until not a fragment the length of a sword was left. She was absolutely ground to powder. As the day advanced, hunger compelled us to think of our commissariat, but to speak a syllable which our new friends of the shore could understand was beyond all our literature. How little I should have dreamed 3 months before of being starved for not speaking Caramanian. However, there is a language which was made before the alphabet, and of this we availed ourselves with great vigor. We pointed to our mouths and our haversacks, which were equally unemployed, and the benevolent savages, every soul of them robbers by regular profession, from father to son, since the days of Pompey the Great, intimated in the same language that we should soon be better provided for. With some of us there arose the not irrational doubt whether this was to be accomplished by feeding us or making us feed them. Soldiers are no great geographers. The line leave that business to the staff to the artillery to the engineers, and the engineers to Providence. At our council, which was held on a row of knapsacks, and with one pair of trousers among its 7 sages, it was asserted with equal show of reason that we were in Africa, in Arabia, in Turkey, and in the Black Sea. However, our sheepskin friends were urgent for our departure, and pointed towards some of their fellows who were making gestures of all kinds up the mountain. We began to climb. The rocks were sharp, slippery with seaweeds, and almost perpendicular. When we had scrambled up about halfway, I looked round, and the crowd of climbers clinging to this huge wall of rock in their red jackets looked like a flight of flamingos. I was more fortunate than the rest. After infinite fatigue, and the coming into my head of some of those toys of desperation which prompt men on precipices to finish their trouble and their lives together, I had scrambled into a large fissure of the cliff, from which the way to the summit was comparatively easy. On that summit stood a colossal savage telegraphing his countrymen as they ascended, and apparently exchanging signals with a party on the opposite side of the ridge. I will confess that the thought occurred with renewed force to me that on that spot our necks were to be broken. The man was almost a giant. He was naked to the waist, and his magnificent muscular figure and bust-like head and countenance might have served for the model of a classic hero. But I was never less charmed by the picturesque in the human form, and involuntarily looked round to see in what corner of the rock I could best make battle. The Caramanian, observing my reluctance, plunged down, caught me in his arms like a child, and in a moment sprang with me to the summit of the precipice. The ridge was not the breadth of a horse's back. He seated me on it astride, and fixed me in astonishment indescribable. The sight below was like magic. I sat on the edge of a circle of mighty precipices surrounding a vast and lovely bay. Never was the richest bowl of porcelain more strangely figured and richly stained than the sides of this magnificent cup. Never was molten silver more shining than the waters within its round. Upon these waters lay a fleet, and upon their shore were moving columns and masses of troops that looked in the depth like huge beds of crimson and blue flowers. I was 5,000 feet above this splendid spectacle. The fleet were the British fleet, and the troops the British army. We had been cast on shore, close to the finest bay in all Asia, the Bay of Marmaris. We finally sailed for Egypt, found the French building fortifications on the shore, and, like a generous enemy, landed just where they had provided for our reception. But the world knows all this already, and I disdain to tell what everybody knows. But the world does not know that we had 3 councils of war to settle whether the troops should land in gaiters or trousers, and whether they should or should not carry 3 days' pipe clay and blacking in their knapsacks. The most valuable facts are, we see, often lost for want of our being a little behind the curtain. The famous landing was the noisiest thing conceivable. The world at a distance called it the most gallant thing, and I have no inclination to stand up against universal opinion. But whether we were fighting against the sandhills, or the French, or the sun and his strength, whether we were going to the right or left or the rear, whether we were beating or beaten, no living man could have told in 2 minutes after the first shot. It was all clamor, confusion, bursting of shells, dashing of water, splitting of boats, and screams of the wounded. The whole passing under a coverlet of smoke as fuliginous as ever rushed from furnace. Under this blanket of the dark, we pulled on, landed, fought, and conquered. And for our triumph had every man his length of excellent sand for the night, the canopy of heaven for his tent, and the profoundest curses of the commissariat for his supper. On we went, day after day, fighting the French, starving and scorching till we found them in our camp before daybreak on the memorable 21st of March. We fought them there as men fight in the pit of a theatre, every one for himself. The French, who are great tacticians, and never fight but for science's sake, grew tired before John Bull, who fights for the love of the thing. The Frenchman fights but to maneuver, the Englishman maneuvers but to fight. So, as maneuvering was out of the question, we carried the affair all after our own hearts. But this victory had its price, for it cost the army its brave old general, and it cost me my old red-nosed lieutenant. We were standing within half a foot of each other, in front of the little ruin where the French invincibles made a last struggle. They fired a volley before they threw themselves on their knees, according to the national custom of earning their lives, when I saw my unlucky friend tumbled head over heels and stretched between my legs. There was no time for thinking of him then. The French were hunted out. La baïonnette dans l'écoute. We followed. The Battle of Alexandria was won, and our part of the success was to be marched 10 miles off to look after some of their fragments of baggage. We found nothing, of course, for neither in defeat nor in victory does the Frenchman ever forget himself. In our bivouac, the thought of the lieutenant came over me. In the heat of the march, I could not have thought of anything mortal but my own parched throat and crippled limbs. Absurd as the old subaltern was, I could have better spared a better man. We had been thrown together in some strange ways, and as the result of my meditations, I determined to return and see what become of the man with the red nose. Leave was easily obtained, for there was something of the odd feeling for him that a regiment has for one of those harmless madmen who sometimes follow its drums in a ragged uniform and formidable hat and feather. It was lucky for the lieutenant that I rode hard, for I found him as near a premature exit as ever hero was. A working party had already made his last bed in the sand, and he was about to take that possession which no ejectment will disturb, when I felt some throbbing about his heart. The soldiers insisted that as they were ordered out for the purpose of inhuming, they should go through with their work. But if they were sullen, I was resolute, and I prevailed to have the subject deferred to the hospital. After an infinity of doubt, I saw my old friend set on his legs again, but my labor seemed in vain. Life was going out. The doctors prohibited the bottle, and the lieutenant felt, like Shylock, that his life was taken away when that was taken, by which he did live. He resigned himself to die with the composure of an ancient philosopher. The night before I marched for Carlo, I sat an hour with him. He was a changed man, talked more rationally than I had believed within the possibility of brains so many years adjust with port, expressed some rough gratitude for my trouble about him, and finally gave me a letter to some of his relatives in England. The regiment was on its march at daybreak. We made our way to Carlo, took possession, wondered at its filth, admired its grand mosque, execrated its water, its provisions, its population, were marched back to storm Alexandria, where I made all possible search for the lieutenant, but in vain, were saved the trouble by the capitulation of the French, were embarked, landed at Portsmouth just 1 year from our leaving it, and as it pleased the wisdom of Napoleon and the folly of our ministry, were disbanded. I had no reason to complain, for though I had been shipwrecked and starved, sick and wounded, I had left neither my life nor my legs behind. Others had been less lucky, and from the losses in the regiment I was now a captain. One day, in looking over the relics of my baggage, a letter fell out. It was the red-nosed lieutenant's. My conscience reproached me, and I believe for the moment my face was as red as his nose. I delivered the letter. It was received by a matron at the head of 3 of the prettiest maidens in all Lancashire, the country of beauty, a blonde, a brunette, and a younger one who was neither, and yet seemed alternately both. I liked the blonde and the brunette infinitely, but the third I did not like, for I fell in love with her, which is a very different thing. The lieutenant was her uncle, and, regretted as his habits were, this family circle had much to say for his generosity. Mary's hazel eye made a fool of me, and I asked her hand that they might make a fool of no one else. The colonel, without the nose, was of course invited to the wedding, and he was in such exultation that either the blonde or the brunette might have been my aunt if she pleased. But they exhibited no tendency to this gay military torso, and the colonel was forced to content himself with the experience of his submissive nephew. The wedding day came. The 3 sisters looked prettier than ever in their vestal white. The colonel gave the bride away, and in their tears and congratulations of this most melancholy of all happy ceremonies, Mary chose her fate. We returned to dinner, and were seated, all smiles, when the door opened, and in walked the red-nosed lieutenant. Had I seen, like Brutus, the immortal Julius's ghost, I could not have been more amazed. But nature was less doubting. The matron threw herself into his arms, the blonde and the brunette clasped each a hand, and my bright-eyed wife forgot her conjugal duties and seemed to forget that I was in the world. There was indeed some reason for doubt. The man before us was fat and florid enough, but the essential distinction of his physiognomy had lost its regal hue. All this, however, was explained by degrees. After my departure for Cairo, he had been given over by the doctors, and, sick of taking physic and determining to die in his own way, he had himself carried up the Nile. The change of air did something for him, the absence of the doctors perhaps more. He domesticated himself among the peasants above the cataracts, drank camel's milk, ate rice, wore a hake, and rode a buffalo. Port was inaccessible, and date brandy was not to his taste. Health forced itself on him, and the sheik of the district began to conceive so good an opinion of the stranger that he offered him his daughter, with a handsome portion of buffaloes, in marriage. The offer was declined, but African offense is a formidable thing, and after having had a carbine load of balls discharged one night through his door, he thought it advisable to leave the neighborhood of his intended father-in-law. I am not about to astonish the world and throw unbelief on my true story by saying that the lieutenant has since drunk nothing but the limpid spring. Whatever were his Mussulman habits, he resumed his native tastes with the force of nature. Port still had temptations for him, but prudence, in the shape of the matron's sister and the pretty nieces, was at hand, and like Sancho's physician, the danger and the glass vanished at a sign from those gentle magicians. Our chief anxiety arose from the good fellowship of the colonel. He had settled within a field of us, and his evenings were spent by our fireside. He had been, by the chances of service, once on campaign with the lieutenant, and all campaigners know that there is no Freemason sign of friendship equal to that of standing to be shot together. But there was an unexpected preservative in this hazardous society. The colonel was incapable of exhibiting in the center of his countenance that living splendor which made Falstaff raise Bardolph. To the honor of his admiral, he could carry no lantern in his poop. If envy could have invaded his generous soul, it would have arisen at the old restored distinction of his comrade. He watched over his regimen, kept him to the most judicious allowance of claret, and the red nose of the lieutenant never flamed again. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, Getting Over the Difficulty by Seba Smith. You can often get over the difficulty when you can't get over the river, said my friend John Van Ben Schoten. Why don't you begin your name with a Sam, said I. It would give it more fullness and roundness, a more musical sound. I do like a full, harmonious name. I don't care what nation it belongs to. Only see how much better it would sound. Sam John Van Ben Schoten. I would make that little addition if I was you. Why, that is my boy's name, said my friend John Van Ben Schoten. You Yankees are always one generation ahead of us Hollanders. Wait till my boy grows up and he'll be just what you want. But don't let us be disputing about names. Our disputes were always of the good-natured sort, and generally confined to the relative advantages of Yankee enterprise and Dutch perseverance. Don't let us be disputing about names, said he, when you ought to be planning how to pay that note tomorrow. You say your draft has come back protested, and you have no other means of raising the money. This was too true. I'd been in a perfect fever all the morning. The return of the draft was most unexpected. Those of whom I had been accustomed to receive accommodations were out of town, and the note in question would do me much injury by lying over. As a last resort, I had applied to my friend John Van Ben Schoten for advice in the matter. I tell you, said John Van Ben Schoten, you can often get over the difficulty when you can't get over the river. Yes, said I, but how? You can do most anything if you only know how. Well, said he, go into my counting room and sit down a minute, and I'll tell you how. We went in, and I took a seat in the shadiest corner near the window. John, before sitting down, reached up over his desk and took down his long pipe. He then opened a little drawer and filled his pipe with fine, dry tobacco, and pulling a lens out of his pocket, he stepped into the sunshine to light it. You don't need that glass, said I. You just hold your pipe in the sun, and if it don't light in half a minute without the glass, I'll engage to eat it. There 'tis again, said John Van Ben Schoten. You are always showing the Yankee. Our fathers always lit their pipes with sunglasses, and now you want to contrive some other way to do it. If I knew I could light it in half the time without the glass, still I would use the glass out of respect to my ancestors. Well, come, said I, this isn't telling me how to get over the difficulty. Wait till I get my little steam engine a-going, said John, still holding the glass in the sun. But haven't you any Locofoco matches, said I, growing somewhat impatient. No, said John, I never allow those newfangled dangerous things to come into my counting room. But how do you get a fire when the sun don't shine, said I. I use a flint and steel, said he, the safest and surest way in the world. At last the pipe began to burn, and John, with the utmost complacency, sat down in his large armchair and began to smoke. Well, now, said I suppose you are ready to open your mind upon this matter, and tell me if you can contrive any plan to help me over this difficulty. Why, yes, said John, you can oftentimes get over the difficulty when you can't get over the river. Did you ever know how Peter Van Horn got married? No, said I. Well, I'll tell you, said John, taking the pipe from his mouth and puffing out a cloud of smoke that almost concealed his head from my view. Oh, now don't stop for any of your long yarns, said I. It is getting toward the close of business hours, and it's very important that this business of mine should be attended to. You Yankees are always too impatient, said John. There's never anything lost by taking time to consider a matter. It is driving the steamboat too fast and trying to go ahead of somebody else that makes her burst her boiler. At that he put his pipe in his mouth and went to smoking again. Well, come, said I, the sooner you begin to tell how Peter Van Horn got married, the sooner you'll get through with it. I know it, said he, and if you won't interrupt me, I'll go on. Yes, says I, a Dutchman must always have his own way. Go ahead. Well then, said John Van Benschoten, throwing himself back in his chair and leisurely blowing the smoke in a long, steady, quiet roll from his mouth, about 100 years ago, Peter Van Horn lived at Schenectady, or near where Schenectady now is, for it was a kind of a wilderness place then. You've been at Schenectady, haven't you? No, said I never have. Well, it is about 15 or 20 miles from Albany. You've been at Albany, of course. No, I haven't, said I. Not been at Albany, said John, staring at me with rather an incredulous look. Then you haven't seen much of the world yet? Why, no, said I, perhaps not a great deal on this side of it, though I have seen something of the other side of it, and a little of both ends. John laughed and went on with his story. Peter Van Horn lived near Schenectady, on one of the little streams that empty into the Mohawk. His father was one of the first settlers in that region, and the old gentleman brought up a nice family, a fine set of hardy, industrious fellows, every one of them as steady as a mill horse. No wild oats, they weren't men before they were boys. The consequence was they picked up the money and always had a comfortable share of this world's goods. Well, Peter, he grew up to be a smart young man, and at last he got it into his head that he wanted to be married. You know how 'tis. Young men nowadays are apt to get such notions into their heads, and it was just so in old times. I don't know as Peter was to blame for that, for there was living a little ways up the hill above his father's Betsy Van Hayden, a round, rosy-cheeked, blue-eyed girl, as neat as a new pin, and as smart as a steel trap. Every time Peter saw her, his feelings became more interested in her. Somehow he could not seem to keep his mind off of her. Sometimes when he was hoeing corn in the field, the first thing he would know, his father would call out to him, "Peter, what do you stand there leaning over your hoe handle for?" And then he would start and color up to the eyes and go to work. He knew he had been thinking of Betsy Van Hayden, but how long he had been standing still he couldn't tell. At last things grew worse and worse, and he found he couldn't live without Betsy Van Hayden nohow, so he went and popped the question to her, and Betsy said she was willing if mother was. Gals in them days were remarkably well brought up in comparison of what they are nowadays. So after a while Peter mustered up courage enough to go and ask the old folks, and the old folks, after taking 2 days to consider of it, said yes, for why shouldn't they? Peter was one of the most industrious young men in the whole valley of the Mohawk. And now that the road was all open and plain before him, Peter was for hurrying ahead. He didn't see any use at all in waiting. Betsy was for putting it off 2 months till she could get another web out of the loom. But Peter said no, he didn't care a snap about another web. They'd be married first and make the cloth afterward. Betsy at last yielded the point. She said she did want to make up a few articles before they were married, but she supposed they might get along without them. So they finally fixed on Thursday of the following week for the wedding. The work of preparation was soon commenced and carried out in a liberal style. Everything requisite for a grand feast was collected, cooked, and arranged in apple pie order. The guests were all invited, and Parson Van Brunt was engaged to be there precisely at 3 o'clock, in order that they might get through the business and have supper out of the way in season for all to get home before dark. Thus far, up to the evening before the wedding day, everything looked fair and promising. Peter retired to bed early, in the hope of getting a good night's rest, but somehow or other he never was so restless in his life. He shut his eyes with all his might, and tried to think of sheep jumping over a wall, but do all he could, sleep wouldn't come. Before midnight the doors and windows began to rattle with a heavy wind. Peter got up and looked out. It was dark and cloudy. Presently flashes of lightning were seen, and heavy thunder came rolling from the clouds and echoing among the hills. In half an hour more a heavy torrent of rain was beating upon the house. It will soon be over, thought Peter, and the air will be beautiful tomorrow, as sweet as a rose. What a fine day we shall have. Hour after hour passed away, and the rain still came down in a flood. Peter could not sleep a wink all night. He got up and walked the floor till daylight, and when he looked out upon the roads and the fields, the water was standing in every hollow and running down the hillsides in rivulets. 9, 10, and 11 o'clock passed, and still it rained. Peter had been up to Mr. Van Hayden's twice through the rain to see how affairs went on there. The family looked rather sad, but Betsy said she had faith to believe that it would hold up before 3 o'clock, and sure enough, about 12 o'clock, while the families were at dinner, it did hold up, and the clouds began to clear away. About 2 o'clock the wedding guests began to assemble at Mr. Van Hayden's, and the faces of all began to grow shorter and brighter. All this time it had not entered Peter's head or the heads of any of the rest of the company that there might be any difficulty in the way of Parson Van Brunt's coming to their aid in completing the marriage ceremony. They had all this time forgotten that they were on one side of the Tomhennock stream and Parson Van Brunt on the other, that there was no bridge over the stream, and that it was now so swollen by the flood, and the current was so rapid that it was almost as much as a man's life was worth to attempt to cross it at the usual fording place, or swim it on horseback. At last, about 2:30 o'clock, Parson Van Brunt, true to his promise, was seen riding down the hill on the opposite side of the river and approaching the ford. "There he is," said old Mrs. Van Hayden, who had been upon the lookout for the last half hour. "There's the dear good man. Now let us all take our seats and be quiet before he comes in." While they were still lingering at the doors and windows and watching the parson as he came slowly down the hill, he reached the bank of the river and stopped. He sat upon his horse some minutes, looking first upstream and then downstream, and then he rode his horse a few rods up and down the bank, and returned again to the ford. "What can he be waiting there for?" said Peter. "Sure he has seen the river often enough before, that he needn't stand there so long to look at it." "I can tell you what the difficulty is," said old Mr. Van Hayden. "The river is so high you can't get across." The truth now fell like a flash upon the minds of the whole company. "Do you think so?" said Mr. Van Horn. "I know so," said Mr. Van Hayden. "You can see from here the water is up the bank 2 rods farther than it commonly is, and must be as much as 10 feet deep over the ford now." "What shall we do?" said old Mrs. Van Hayden. "The things will all be spoilt if we don't have the wedding to-day." Betsy began to turn a little pale. Peter took his hat and started off upon a quick walk toward the river, and presently all the men folks followed him. The women folks waited a little while, and seeing Parson Van Brunt still sitting on his horse upon the other side of the river without any attempt to cross, they all put on their bonnets and followed the men. When they got to the bank, the reason of the parson's delay was as clear as preaching. The little river was swollen to a mighty torrent, and was rushing along its banks with the force and rapidity of a cataract. The water had never been so high before since the neighborhood had been settled, and it was still rising. To ford the river was impossible, and to attempt to swim it on horseback was highly dangerous. "What shall we do?" said Peter, calling to the parson across the river. "Well, I think you will have to put it off 2 or 3 days till the river goes down," said Parson Van Brunt. "Tell him we can't put it off," said old Mrs. Van Hayden, touching Peter by the elbow, "for the pies and cakes and things will all be spoilt." "Ask him if he don't think his horse can swim over," said Betsy in a half-whisper, standing the other side of Peter. Peter again called to the parson, told him what a disappointment it would be if he didn't get over, and that it was the general opinion his horse could swim over with him if he would only try. Parson Van Brunt was devoted to the duties of his profession, and ready to do anything, even at the risk of his life, for the good of his flock. So he reined up his horse tightly, gave him the whip, and plunged into the stream. The current was too rapid and powerful for the animal, and horse and rider were carried downstream with fearful speed for about 12 rods, when they made out to land again on the same side from which they started. All were now satisfied that the parson could not get over the river. The experiment already made was attended with such fearful hazard as to preclude all thought of its repetition. "Oh dear, what shall we do?" said Mrs. Van Hayden. "Was there ever anything so unlucky?" Betsy sighed, and Peter bit his lips with vexation. Peter's mother all this while had not uttered a syllable. She was a woman that never talked, but she did up a great deal of deep thinking. At last, very much to the surprise of the whole company, she spoke out loud and said, "It seems to me if Parson Van Brunt can't get over the river, he might get over difficulties somehow or other." "Well, how in the world can he do it?" said Peter. "Why, you just take hold of Betsy's hand," said his mother, "and stand up here, and let the parson marry you across the river." This idea struck them all very favorably. They didn't see why it couldn't be done. Peter again called to Parson Van Brunt and stated to him the proposition, and asked him if he thought there was anything in the law or in the Bible that could go against the match if it was done in that way. Parson Van Brunt sat in a deep study about 5 minutes, and then said he couldn't see anything in the way, and told them they might stand up and take hold of hands. When they had taken their proper positions, and old Mrs. Van Hayden had put her handkerchief to her face to hide the tears that began to start from her eyes, the parson read over, in a loud and solemn tone, the marriage ceremony, and pronounced them man and wife. Peter then threw a couple of silver dollars across the river, which Parson Van Brunt gathered up and put in his pocket, and then mounted his horse and started for home, while the company upon the other side of the river returned to the house of Mr. Van Hayden to enjoy the wedding feast. By this time John Van Ben Schoten's pipe had gone out, and he started to the window again with his lens to relight it. "Well," said I understand now how Peter Van Horn got over his difficulty, but I'll be hanged if I can see any clearer how I am going to get over mine." "None so blind as them that won't see," said John, turning to his desk and pulling out his old rusty yellow pocket-book. He opened it and counted out the sum of money which I lacked. "There," said he, "go and pay your note, and remember you can sometimes get over the difficulty when you can't get over the river." End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. Terrific Encounter with a Pirate. Speaking of a formidable pirate, said to have been lately seen in the West Indies, the Richmond Star takes occasion to give the following particulars of an encounter with freebooters several years ago in the same latitude, which have never before appeared in print, and which are nevertheless true. The general facts of the case are these. Captain Robinson, now a wealthy and much respected citizen of New York, while in command of a ship many years ago, at a time when several of the European powers were at war, discovered one day, just as night was setting in, a suspicious-looking sail under his lee. But as the stranger made no movement towards him, he concluded that she was probably one of the many privateers which then swarmed the ocean. The next morning he discovered the stranger's sail nearer to him, and very soon became satisfied that she was not only hostile but a pirate. He had one gun, and an abundance of small arms and ammunition on board, and fortunately a good number of passengers, mostly men. When satisfied that he had no alternative but to fight or surrender, he assembled the passengers in the cabin and told them that they must decide whether they would surrender and be themselves murdered, and give their wives and daughters to the brutality of the fiends then pursuing them, or stand upon their defence like men. If they chose the latter alternative, he gave them a fair warning that it must be a desperate conflict, and that boarding the pirate was probably their only chance of success. Most of the passengers responded promptly that they would fight to the last, if fight they must. Although to the windward it was found that the superior sailing of the pirate was more than a match in a long chase for this advantage, and Robinson resolved at once to meet the crisis and decide the matter while his position gave him the choice of commencing the engagement. He steered at once to meet the foe, thus giving him to understand that he was prepared for him. As he neared him, the pirate gave him a broadside from the guns, 3 in number, that crippled him badly, killing 2 of his best seamen and 1 passenger. Still he kept on, receiving another broadside that injured him some, but not as badly as the first. In a few moments he was near the pirate, and by a skilful manoeuvre got a raking position, and taking good aim, he for the first time discharged his guns, loaded heavily with canister and grape. The effect was tremendous, the vessel being much cut up, and the slaughter among the pirate crew prodigious. This created confusion among them, and enabled Robinson to plant his bow against the pirate just where he preferred. In an instant the bowsprit was crowded with the devils, looking like very fiends, who dashed upon the forward deck in large force. A bloody struggle then ensued, hand to hand, in which the ship's defenders were driven back by the overwhelming force, and the prospect for an instant was that they would all be annihilated beyond the chance of hope. At this moment some of the passengers shouted in English to their friends to clear the way, stand back for the gun. The Spaniards raised a yell of triumph as they saw their foes, who had met them so sturdily, rush back, and were in the act of springing forward as the murderous charge of the gun met them with sweeping carnage, leaving but a few alive and covering the deck with the mangled remains of more than a score of the wretches. But a fresh force supplied their place, and for several times the good gun cleared the deck of the bloodthirsty villains. As they went leaping back the fourth time, Robinson shouted to his men to board, and in a moment the strife was upon the pirate's own deck. The force of the pirate had been terribly cut down in the previous contest, and after a short but desperate struggle, in which Captain Robinson received a shocking wound from a cutlass passing from his forehead, between his eyes, across the cheek, and down to the back of the neck, yet he killed the man who wounded him and 2 others after receiving the slash. The pirates were driven below and there secured. The cabin was then cleared of everything valuable, the vessel scuttled, and in a short time she sank, carrying with her every soul left on board, with the wounded, dying, and dead. Captain Robinson was wounded in many places, besides the last shocking wound across his face, the scar of which he yet bears, and many of his force had fallen or were desperately wounded. But he carried his ship safe through her voyage, and was able to tell one of the most gallant and desperate actions of which we ever heard, or which history can show. End of section 5. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, Friendship of a Panther, or A Soldier in the Desert. We know not the author of the following beautiful tale, which we are sure no one can read without intense interest. It has been in our possession in newspaper form something more than a dozen years, but bearing no indication of its origin. Poor Mignon, she cannot but enlist the sympathies of every reader. During the enterprising expedition into Upper Egypt by General Desaix, a provincial soldier fell into the power of a tribe of Arabs called Grabin, and was by them carried into the desert beyond the cataract of the Nile. In order to place a safe distance between themselves and the French army, the Grabin made a forced march and did not stop till night closed in. They encamped around a fountain surrounded by palm trees. Not supposing their prisoner would attempt to escape, they contented themselves with merely binding his hands, and after having fed their horses and made their supper upon dates, they all of them slept soundly. As soon as the French prisoner was convinced of this fact, he began to gnaw the cords that bound him, and soon regained the liberty of his hands. He seized a carbine, and took the precaution to provide himself with some dry dates and a little bag of grain, and armed with a scimitar, started off in the direction of the French army. In his eagerness to arrive at a place of safety, he urged the already wearied horse until the generous animal fell down dead and left his rider alone in the midst of the desert. For a long time the Frenchman walked on with the perseverance of a runaway slave, but he was at last obliged to stop. The day was finished. Notwithstanding the beauty and freshness of Oriental nights, he did not feel strength enough to pursue his journey. Having reached a little cluster of palms, which had gladdened his heart from a distance, he laid his head upon a stone and slept without taking any precaution for his defence. He was awakened by the pitiless rays of the sun, which fell upon him with intolerable fervour, for in his weariness he had reposed on the side opposite to the morning shadows of the majestic palms. The prospect around filled him with despair. In every direction nothing met his eye but a wide ocean of sand, sparkling and glancing like a dagger in the sunshine. The pure brilliancy of the sky left the imagination nothing to desire. Not a cloud obscured its splendour, not a zephyr moved the surface of the desert. The earth and the heavens seemed on fire. They met at the horizon in a line of light, as fine and glittering as the edge of a sword. There was a wild and awful majesty in the universal stillness. God in all his infinity seemed present to the soul. The desolate wanderer thought of the fountains and roses of his own native province and wept aloud. He clasped the palm as if it had been a living friend. He shouted to relieve the forgetfulness of utter solitude. The wide wilderness sent back a sharp sound from the distance, but no echo was awakened. The echo was in his heart. With melancholy steps he walked around the eminence on which the palm trees grew. To his great joy he discovered on the opposite side a sort of natural grotto formed by a pile of granite. Hope was awakened in his breast. The palms would furnish him with dates for food, and human beings might come that way before they were exhausted. Perhaps another party of margravins, whose wandering life began to have some charms for his imagination, where he might hear the noise of approaching cannon, for Bonaparte was then passing over Egypt. The Frenchman experienced a sudden transition from the deepest despair to the wildest joy. He occupied himself during the day with cutting down some of the palm trees to defend the mouth of the grotto against wild beasts, which would probably come in the night time to drink at the rivulet flowing at the foot of the palms. Notwithstanding the eagerness produced by fear of being devoured in his sleep, he could not finish his fortifications during that day. Toward evening the mighty tree he had been cutting fell to the ground with a crash that resounded through the desert as if solitude had uttered a deep groan. The soldier trembled as if there had been a supernatural voice in the air, but like an heir who soon ceases to mourn over a rich parent, he immediately began to strip off the broad and beautiful leaves to form his couch for the night. Fatigued by his exertions and the extreme warmth of climate, he soon fell into a profound slumber. In the middle of the night his sleep was suddenly disturbed by an extraordinary noise. He raised himself and listened, and amid the deep silence he distantly heard the loud breathing of some powerful animal. The sound fell upon his heart like ice. The hair started upon his head, and he strained his eyes to the utmost to perceive the object of his terror. He caught the glimpse of two faint yellow lights at a distance from him. He thought it might be an optical delusion produced by his own earnest gaze, but as the rays of the moon entered the chinks of the cave, he distinctly saw an enormous animal laying about 2 feet from him. There was not sufficient light to distinguish what species of animal it was. It might be a lion, a tiger, or a crocodile, but the strong odor that filled the cave left no doubt of the presence of some large and terrible creature. When the moon rose so as to shine directly upon the opening in the grotto, its beam lighted up the beautiful spotted hide of a huge panther. This lion of Egypt slept with her head upon her paws, with the comfortable dignity of a great house dog. Her eyes, which had opened from time to time, were now closed. Her face was turned toward the Frenchman. 1,000 confused thoughts passed through the soldier's bosom. His first idea was to shoot his enemy through the head, but he saw that there was not room enough for that. The ball would inevitably have passed her. He dared not make the slightest movement, lest he should awake her. Nothing broke the deep silence but the breath of the panther and the beating of her heart. Twice he put his hand upon his scimitar, but the difficulty of penetrating her hard, rough skin made him relinquish his project. To attempt her destruction and fail in the attempt would be certain death. At all events, he resolved to wait for daylight. Day came at last, and showed the jaws of the sleeping panther covered with blood. "She has eaten lately," said the Frenchman to himself. "She will not awake in hunger." She was in truth a beautiful monster. The fur on her throat and legs was a dazzling whiteness. A circle of little dark spots like velvet formed pretty bracelets around her paws. Her large muscular tail was beautifully white, terminated by black rings, and the soft smooth fur on her body was of a glowing yellow, like unwrought gold, richly shaded with dark brown spots in the form of roses. This powerful but tranquil hostess reposed in as graceful an attitude as a puss leaping on a footstool. Her head rested on nervous, outstretched paws from which her long white smullers spread out like silver threads. Had she been in a cage, the Frenchman would certainly have admired the perfect symmetry of her dark form and the rich contrast of colours that gave such an imperial brilliancy to her robe. But alone and in her power, it was a very different thing. At the mouth of the cannon he had felt his courage rise with increasing danger, but it was sinking now. The cold sweat poured from his forehead as he watched the sleeping panther. Considering himself a dead man, he waited his fate as courageously as he could. When the sun rose, the panther suddenly opened her eyes, stretched out her paws, and gaped, showing a frightful row of teeth and a great tongue as hard and as rough as a file. She then shook herself and began to wash her bloody paws, passing them from time to time over her ears like a kitten. Very well done, thought the soldier, who felt his gaiety and courage returning. She does her toilet very handsomely. He seized a little dagger which he had taken from one of the Arabs. Come, let us wish each other good morning, thought he. At this moment the panther turned her head toward him suddenly and fixed a surprised and earnest gaze upon him. The fixedness of her bright metallic eyes and their almost insupportable brilliancy made the soldier tremble, especially when the mighty beast moved toward him. With great boldness and presence of mind he looked her directly in the eye, having often heard that great power may be obtained over animals in that manner. When she came up to him, he gently scratched her head and smoothed her fur. Her eyes gradually softened, she began to wag her tail, and at last she purred like a petted cat. But so deep and strong were her notes of joy that they resounded through the cave like the rolling of a church organ. The Frenchman redoubled his caresses, and when he thought her ferocity was sufficiently tamed, he attempted to leave the grotto. The panther made no opposition to his going out, but she soon came bounding after him, lifting up her back and rubbing against his legs like an affectionate kitten. She requires a great deal of attention, said the Frenchman, smiling. He tried to feel her ears and throat, and perceiving she was pleased with it, he began to tickle the back of her head with the point of his dagger, hoping to find a favourable opportunity to stab her, but the hardness of the bones made him tremble lest he should not succeed. The beautiful sultana of the desert seemed to tempt the courage of her prisoner by raising her head, stretching out her neck, and rubbing against him. The soldier suddenly thought that to kill her with one blow he must strike her in the throat. He raised his blade for that purpose, but at that moment she crouched down gently at his feet, looking up in his face with a strange mixture of affectionate and native fierceness. The poor Frenchman leaned against the tree, eating some dates and casting his eye anxiously round the desert to see if no one was coming to free him from his terrible companion, whose strange friendship was so little to be trusted. He offered to feed her with some nuts and dates, but she looked upon them with supreme contempt. However, as if sensible to his kind intentions, she licked his shoes and purred. Will it be so when she gets hungry, thought the Frenchman. The idea made him tremble. He looked at the size of the panther. She was 3 feet high and 4 feet long, without including her tail, which was nearly 3 feet more in length and as round as a great cudgel. Her head was as big as a lion's, and her face was distinguished by a peculiar expression of cunning. The cold cruelty of the tiger reigned there, but there was likewise something strangely like the countenance of an artful woman in the gaiety and fondness of the present moment. She seemed like Nero drunk. She had her fill of blood, and she wished to frolic. During the whole day, if he attempted to walk away, the panther watched him as a dog does his master, and never suffered him to be far out of sight. He discovered the remains of his horse, which had been dragged near the mouth of the cavern, and he easily understood why she had respected his slumbers. Taking courage from the past, he began to hope he could get along very comfortably with his new companion. He laid himself by her in order to conciliate her good opinion. He patted her neck, and she began to wag her tail and purr. He took hold of her paws, felt her ears, and rolled her over the grass. She suffered him to do all this, and when he played with her paws, she carefully drew in her claws, lest she should hurt him. The Frenchman again put his hand upon his weapon, with a view of plunging it in her throat, but he was still held by the fear that he should not succeed, and that the animal would tear him to pieces in her agony. Besides, he really began to have an unwillingness to kill her. In the lonely desert she seemed to him like a friend. His admiration of her beauty, gentleness, graceful activity became mixed with less and less of terror. He actually named her Mignonne, in remembrance of a lady whom he had loved in his youth, and who was abominably jealous of him. By the end of the day he had become so familiar with his dangerous situation that he was almost in love with its exciting perils. He had even taught the panther her name. She looked up in his face when he called Mignonne. When the sun went down, she uttered a deep, melancholy cry. She is well educated, exclaimed the gay soldier. She had learned to say her evening prayers. He was rejoiced to see the Panther stretch herself out in a drowsy attitude. That is right, my pretty little blonde, said he. You'd better go to sleep first. He trusted to his own activity to escape during her slumber. He waited patiently, and when she seemed sound asleep, he walked vigorously toward the Nile. But he had not gone a quarter of a league over the sand when he heard the Panther bounding after him, uttering at intervals a loud, sharp cry. Of a truth, said he, her friendship is very flattering. It must be her first love. Before she came up, the Frenchman fell into one of those dangerous traps of loose sand from which it is impossible to extricate oneself. The Panther seized him by the collar, and with incredible strength brought him safe to the other side of the ditch at a single bound. My dear Mignon, exclaimed the soldier, caressing her with enthusiasm, our friendship is for life and death. He retraced his steps. Now he had a creature that loved him, to whom he could talk. It seemed as if the desert were peopled. Having made a signal flag of his shirt, he concluded to wait patiently for human succor. It was his intention to have watch during the night, but sleep overpowered him. When he awoke, Mignon was gone. He ascended the eminence to look for her, and soon perceived her at a distance clearing the desert with those long high bounds peculiar to her species. She arrived with bloody jaws. When receiving his caresses, she purred aloud and fixed her eyes upon him with even more fondness than usual. The soldier patted her neck and talked to her as he would to a domestic animal. Ah, miss, you have been eating some of the mort gratin. Ain't you ashamed? Never mind, they are worse animals than you are, but please don't take a fancy to grind up a Frenchman. If you do, you won't have me to love you any more. This singular animal was so fond of caresses and play that if her companion sat many minutes without noticing her, she would put her paw in his lap to attract attention. Several days passed thus. The Panther was always successful in her excursions for food, and always returned full of affection and joy. She became used to all the inflections of the soldier's voice and understood the expression of his face. Sometimes he amused his weary hours by counting the spots on her golden fur and observing how beautifully they were shaded. She showed no displeasure even when he held her by the tail to count the splendid black and white rings that glittered in the sunshine like precious stones. It was a pleasure to look upon the graceful outlines of her form, the glossy smoothness of her neck, and the majestic carriage of her head. But she delighted him most when she was in a frolic. Her extreme gracefulness and agility as she glided swiftly along, jumped, bounded, and rolled over and over, was truly surprising. When she was darting up the rocky eminence at her swiftest speed, she would stop suddenly and beautifully, with head erect, as the Frenchman called mignon. One day, very large birds sailed through the air over their heads. In the desert, anything that has life is intensely interesting. The Frenchman quitted the Panther to watch the flight of the bird, as he slowly and heavily fanned the air. In a few minutes, the sultana of the desert began to growl. She is certainly jealous, thought the soldier, as he looked at her fierce and glittering eyes. They gazed intelligibly at each other, and the proud coquette leaped as she felt his hand upon her head. Her eyes flashed like lightning, and she shut them hard. The creature must have a soul, exclaimed the Frenchman. This account was given me by the soldier himself while I was admiring the docility of the powerful animals in the menagerie of Paris. I do not know, continued the narrator, what I had done to displease Mignon so much, or whether the creature was merely in sport, but she turned and snapped her teeth at me and seized hold of my leg. She did it without violence, but thinking she was about to devour me, I plunged my dagger into her neck. The poor creature rolled over, uttering a cry that froze my heart. She made no attempt to revenge my blow, but looked mildly upon me in her dying agony. I would have given all the world to have recalled her to life. It was as if I had murdered a friend. Some French soldiers who discovered my signal found me some hours afterwards weeping by the side of her dead body. Ah, well, said he, after a mournful silence, I've been in the wars in Germany, Spain, Prussia, and France, but I never have seen anything that produced such sensations as the desert. Oh, how beautiful it was! What feelings did it excite? Asked I. Feelings that are not to be spoken, replied the soldier solemnly. I do not always regret my cluster of palm trees and my Panther, but sometimes their remembrance makes me sad. In the desert there is everything, and there is nothing. What do you mean by that? Said I. I cannot tell, said he impatiently. After a pause, he added, God is there without man. Rabelais tells a story of one Philipot Pyact, who, being brisk and hale, fell dead as he was paying an old debt, which perhaps causes many not to pay theirs for fear of a like accident. End of section 6.
Section 7 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7, Blannerhasset, the Lord of the Isle, by T.B. Reid. What ship comes so gallantly over the sea, with wide-spreading pinions and streamer full free, and making for harbour the while? It comes from a country where tyranny reigns, it comes from a country all laden with chains. Alas for the Emerald Isle! Who walks so majestic the deck of that ship, a tear in his eye, yet a smile on his lip, his bonny bride by him the while? A free man in spirit, a free man by blood, the kind Blannerhasset, the gentle and good, a son of the Emerald Isle. The bark is in harbour, her sails are all furled, the exile erect walks the new western world, and a prayer breathes to heaven the while. Now far to the west, over mountains through wood, he seeks a retreat in the deep solitude, this son of the Emerald Isle. What green isle is yonder, that seemeth to lie on Ohio's fair breast, like a star in the sky, where nature in gladness doth smile? Who dwells in yon mansion, all shaded by wood? The exile of Erin, the gentle and good, and this Blannerhasset's own isle. Oh, this is an Eden, a paradise where sweet flowers are blooming, and on the blessed air are breathing their fragrance the while. The birds from the branches their melody pour, and bright waters murmur along the green shore, and cheer the sad lord of the isle. Years now have rolled by since that mansion was reared, and long has the exile by all been revered, a man of pure heart without guile. The Indian, the hunter, all these were regaled, by him were made welcome, by them he was hailed, the kind-hearted lord of the isle. What stranger is this who has stepped to the land, who gallantly carries an air of command, whose features are lit with a smile? The one who the virtuous should dread to come nigh, though sweet is his tongue, yet there's death in his eye. Alas for the lord of the isle! Though bland in his bearing, his heart is of stone. Ambition has marked him full well for her own. His passions are vilest of vile. 'Tis he who has sought out the sweet solitude, to sear with his burning the heart of the good and too trusting lord of the isle. Ah, little they reck the extent of his reach, so gentle his manners, so kind is his speech, so noble, so winning the while. Too sure is the art, too sure is the snare. Alas, now the lord and his lady so fair must leave and forever the isle. That island so lovely is dreary, alas! I cannot but sigh for its lord as I pass, a tear is half starting the while. The flowers all have faded, the sweet singing birds, and ripples alone seem to echo the words, alas for the lord of the isle. The trial of Colonel Burr for treason occurred 36 years ago. More than the average time allowed for one generation of men to pass away. The circumstances of the case, therefore, cannot be supposed to be very familiar to a majority of readers now on the stage. All, however, who know anything of the matter, either from recollection or from history, are aware of the strong sympathy excited in the public mind for the unfortunate Blannerhasset, who was implicated with Burr, and whether sharing in his guilt or not, suffered the withering effects of the transaction and was ultimately ruined. Whatever may have been the real connection of Blannerhasset with the affair, and whatever the true measure of his guilt or innocence, the glowing eloquence of Mr. Wirt at the trial has thrown a charm over his memory that will touch the hearts of his adopted countrymen for many generations to come. Well do we remember with what emotion our bosoms were filled when in our schoolboy days we committed to memory for declamation the extract of Wirt's speech relating to Blannerhasset. We give it below as an explanatory of the ballad from our friend Reed. Aaron Burr, the contriver of the whole conspiracy, to everybody concerned in it, was as the sun to the planets which surround him. Did he not bind them to their respective orbits, and give them their light, their heat, and their motion? Yet he is to be considered an accessory, and Blannerhasset is to be the principal. Let us put the case between Burr and Blannerhasset. Let us compare the two men and settle this question of precedence between them. Who Aaron Burr is we have seen in part already. I will add that beginning his operations in New York, he associates with him men whose wealth is to supply the necessary funds. Possessed of the mainspring, his personal labour contrives all the machinery. Pervading the continent from New York to New Orleans, he draws into his plan, by every allurement which he can contrive, men of all ranks and descriptions. To youthful ardour he presents danger and glory, to ambition rank and titles and honours, to avarice the mines of Mexico. To each person whom he addresses he presents the object adapted to his taste. His recruiting officers are appointed. Men are engaged throughout the continent. Civil life is indeed quiet upon its surface, but in its bosom this man has contrived to deposit the materials which, with the slightest touch of his match, produce an explosion to shake the continent. All this his restless ambition has contrived, and in the autumn of 1806 he goes forth for the last time to apply this match. On this occasion he meets with Blannerhasset. Who is Blannerhasset? A native of Ireland, a man of letters, who fled from the storms of his own country to find quiet in ours. His history shows that war is not the natural element of his mind. If it had been, he never would have exchanged Ireland for America. So far is an army from furnishing the society natural and proper to Mr. Blannerhasset's character, that on his arrival in America he retired even from the population of the Atlantic States, and sought quiet and solitude in the bosom of our western forests. But he carried with him taste and science and wealth, and lo, the desert smiled. Possessing himself of a beautiful island in the Ohio, he rears upon it a palace and decorates it with every romantic embellishment of fancy. A shrubbery that Shenstone might have envied blooms around him. Music that might have charmed Calypso and her nymphs is his. An extensive library spreads its treasures before him. A philosophical apparatus offers to him all the secrets and mysteries of nature. Peace, tranquillity, and innocence shed their mingled delights around him. And to crown the enchantment of the scene, a wife, who is said to be lovely even beyond her sex, and graced with every accomplishment that can render it irresistible, had blessed him with her love and made him father of her children. The evidence would convince you that this is but a faint picture of the real life. In the midst of all this peace, his innocent simplicity and his tranquillity, this feast of the mind, this pure banquet of the heart, the destroyer comes. He comes to change this paradise into a hell. Yet the flowers do not wither at his approach. No monitory shuddering through the bosom of their unfortunate possessor warns him of the ruin that is coming upon him. a stranger presents himself. Introduced to their civilities by the high rank which he had lately held in his country, he soon finds his way to their hearts by the dignity and elegance of his demeanour, the light and beauty of his conversation, and the seductive and fascinating power of his address. The conquest was not difficult. Innocence is ever simple and credulous. Conscious of no design itself, it suspects none in others. It wears no guard before its breast. Every door and portal and avenue of the heart is thrown open, and all who choose it enter. Such was the state of Eden when the serpent entered its bowers. The prisoner, in a more engaging form, winding himself into the open and unpractised heart of the unfortunate Blannerhasset, found but little difficulty in changing the native character of that heart and the objects of its affection. By degrees he infuses into it the poison of his own ambition. He breathes into it the fire of his own courage, a daring and desperate thirst for glory, and ardour panting for great enterprises, for all the storm and bustle and hurricane of life. In a short time the whole man is changed, and every object of his former delight is relinquished. No more he enjoys the tranquil scene. It has become flat and insipid to his taste. His books are abandoned, his retort and crucible are thrown aside. His shrubbery blooms and breathes its fragrance upon the air in vain. He likes it not. His ear no longer drinks the rich melody of music, it longs for the trumpet's clangour and the cannon's roar. Even the prattle of his babes, once so sweet, no longer affects him, and the angel smile of his wife, which hitherto touched his bosom with ecstasy so unspeakable, is now unseen and unfelt. Greater objects have taken possession of his soul. His imagination has been dazzled by visions of diadems, and stars and garters and titles of nobility. He has been taught to burn with restless emulation at the names of great heroes and conquerors. His enchanted island is destined soon to relapse into a wilderness. And in a few months we find the beautiful and tender partner of his bosom, whom he lately permitted not the winds of summer to visit too roughly, we find her shivering at midnight on the winter banks of the Ohio, and mingling her tears with the torrents that froze as they fell. Yet this unfortunate man, thus deluded from his interest and his happiness, thus seduced from the paths of innocence and peace, thus confounded in the toils that were deliberately spread for him, and overwhelmed by the mastering spirit and genius of another, this man, thus ruined and undone, and made to play a subordinate part in their grand drama of guilt and treason, this man is to be called the principal offender, while he, by whom he was thus plunged into misery, is comparatively innocent, a mere accessory. Is this reason? Is this law? Is this humanity? Sir, neither the human heart nor the human understanding will bear a perversion so monstrous and absurd, so shocking to the soul, so revolting to reason. Let Aaron Burr then not shrink from the high destination which he has courted, and having already ruined Blannerhasset in fortune, character, and happiness for ever, let him not attempt to finish the tragedy by thrusting that ill-fated man between himself and punishment. End of section 7. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 23. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Erin Stone. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8, The Last Voyage, by Mrs. Opie. We cannot fail to observe, as we advance in life, how vividly our earliest recollections recur to us, and this consciousness is accompanied by a melancholy pleasure when we are deprived of those who are most tenderly associated with such remembrances, because they bring the beloved dead before our mind's eye, and beguile the loneliness of the present hour by visions of the past. In such visions I now often love to indulge, and in one of them, A Journey to Y, was recently brought before me, in which my ever-indulgent father permitted me to accompany him when I was yet but a child. As we drove through C, a village within 3 miles of Y, he directed my attention to a remarkable rising or conical mound of earth on the top of the tower of C Church. He then kindly explained the cause of this singular and distinguishing appearance, and told me the traditionary anecdote connected with it, which now, in my own words, I am going to communicate to my readers. I know nothing of her birth and parentage, nor am I acquainted even with her name, but I shall call her Bertha. The story goes that she lived at C, a village 3 miles from Y-N-N, and was betrothed to the mate of a trading vessel, with the expectation of marrying him, when he had gained money sufficient, by repeated voyages, to make their union consistent with prudence. In the meanwhile, there is reason to believe that Bertha was not idle, but contrived to earn money herself in order to expedite the hour of her marriage, and at length her lover, whom I shall call William, thought that there was no reason for him to continue his seafaring life, but at the end of one voyage more he should be able to marry the woman of his choice, and engage in some less dangerous employment in his native village. Accordingly, the next time that he bade farewell to Bertha, the sorrow of their parting hour was soothed by William's declaring that, as the next voyage would be his last, he should expect, when he returned, to find everything ready for their marriage. This was a pleasant expectation, and Bertha eagerly prepared to fulfill it. By the time that Bertha was beginning to believe that William was on his voyage home, her neighbors would often help her to count the days which would probably elapse before the ship could arrive, but when they were not in her presence, some of the experienced among the men used to express a hope, the result of fear, that William would return time enough to avoid certain winds, which would make one part of the navigation on that coast particularly dangerous. Bertha herself had, no doubt, her fears, as well as her hope, but there were some fears which the lip of affection dare not utter, and this was one of them. Bertha dreaded to have her inquiries respecting that dangerous passage answered by "Yes, we know that it is a difficult navigation." She also dreaded to be told by some kind but ill-judging friends to trust in Providence, as by such advice the reality of the danger would still be more powerfully confirmed to her. This recommendation would to her have been needless, as well as alarming, for she had, doubtless, always relied on him who was alone able to save, and she knew that the same almighty arm was underneath her lover still, which had hitherto preserved him in the time of need. Well, time went on, and we will imagine the little garden before the door of the house which Bertha had hired, new, gravelled, fresh flowers sown and planted there, the curtains ready to be put up, the shelves bright with polished utensils, table main white as the driven snow, enclosed in a newly purchased chest of drawers, and the neat, well-chosen wedding clothes ready for the approaching occasion. We will also picture to ourselves the trembling joy of Bertha when her eager and sympathizing neighbors rushed into her cottage, disturbing her early breakfast with the glad tiding that William's ship had been seen approaching the dangerous passage with a fair wind, and there was no doubt but that he would get over it safe and in daylight. But Bertha's joy was still mingled with anxiety, and she probably passed that day in alternate restlessness and prayer. Toward night the wind rose high, blowing from a quarter unfavorable to the safety of the ship, and it still continued to blow in this direction when night and darkness had closed on all around. Darkness at that moment seemed to close also upon the prospects of Bertha, for she knew that there was no beacon, no landmark to warn the vessel of its danger, and inform the pilot what coast they were approaching, and what perils they were to avoid. And it is probable that the almost despairing girl was, with her anxious friends, that livelong night a wanderer on the nearest shore. With the return of morning came the awful confirmation of their worst fears. There was no remaining vestige of William's vessel, save the top of the mast, which showed where it had sunk beneath the waves, and proved that the hearts which in the morning had throbbed high with tender hopes and joyful expectations were then cold and still beneath the mighty waters. How different now was the scene in Bertha's cottage to that which it exhibited during the preceding morning. That changed dwelling was not indeed deserted, for sympathizing neighbors came to it as before, but though many may be admitted with readiness when it is time for congratulations, it is only the few who can be welcome in a season of sorrow, and Bertha's sorrow, though quiet, was deep, while neither her nearest relative nor dearest friend could do anything to assist her, save by removing from her sight the new furniture or the new dresses which had been prepared for those happy hours that now could never be hers. At length, however, Bertha, who had always appeared calm and resigned, seemed cheerful also. Still she remained pale, as in the first moments of her trial, save when a feverish flush occasionally increased the brightness of her eyes, but she grew thinner, and her impeded breath made her affectionate friends suspect that she was going into a rapid decline. Medical aid was immediately called in, and Bertha's pleased conviction that her end was near was soon, though reluctantly confirmed to her, at her own request. But it was not alone the wish to die and be with Christ, nor the sweet expectations of being united in another world to him whom she had lost, that was the cause of Bertha's increasing cheerfulness, as the hour of her dissolution drew nigh. No, her generous heart was rejoicing in a project which she had conceived, and which would, if realized, be the source of benefit to numbers yet unborn. She knew from authority which she could not doubt, that had there been a proper landmark on the shore, her lover and his ship would not, in all human probability, have perished. "Then," said Bertha, "henceforth there shall be a landmark on this coast, and I will furnish it. Here at least, no fond and faithful girl shall again have to lament over her blighted prospects, and pine and suffer as I have done." She sent immediately for the clergyman of the parish, made her will, and had a clause inserted to the following effect: "I desire that I may be buried on the top of the tower of C Church, and that my grave may be made very high and pointed, in order to render it a perpetual landmark to all ships approaching that dangerous navigation where he whom I loved was wrecked. I am assured that, had there been a landmark on the tower of C Church, his ship might have escaped, and I humbly trust that my grave will always be kept up according to my will, to prevent affectionate hearts in future from being afflicted as mine has been, and I leave a portion of my little property in the hands of trustees, forever to pay for the preservation of the above-mentioned grave in all its usefulness." Before she died, the judicious and benevolent sufferer had the satisfaction of being assured that her intentions would be carried into effect. Her last moments were therefore cheered by the belief that she would be graciously permitted to be, even after death, a benefit to others, and that her grave might be the means of preserving some of her fellow creatures from shipwreck and affliction. Nor was her belief a delusive one. The conical grave in question gives so remarkable an appearance to the tower of Sea Church, when it is seen at sea, even at a distance, that if once observed it can never be forgotten, even by those to whom the anecdote connected with it is unknown. Therefore, as soon as it appears in sight, pilots know that they are approaching a dangerous coast, and take measures to avoid its perils. But if the navigation on that coast is no longer as perilous as it was when the heroine of this story was buried, and the tower of Sea Church is no longer a necessary landmark, still her grave remains a pleasing memorial of one whose active benevolence rose superior to the selfishness both of sorrow and of sickness, and enabled her, even on the bed of death, to contrive and will for the benefit of posterity. End of Section 8. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 23, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.